Hi, this is Shambhavi. Welcome to my weekly podcast about spirituality, love, death, devotion, and waking up while living in a messy world. The Satsang with Shambhavi podcast is recorded live each week with students of our nonprofit community, Jaya Kula. For more information and to find out about attending a satsang, visit jayakula.org. Thanks for listening. Much love to you, wherever and however you are. Some of us are very attached to deciding. First of all, one of the later things that came as a fruit of practice for me was being able to actually feel and sense time. Our experience of linear time is also part of the communicative theater that we're in. And it is possible to feel for the right time for things. It's possible to feel the texture of time and the conversation that time is having with us, and to respond not with no plans, but in a more fluid way where things get done properly with respect to the bigger circumstance, whatever that might be, and where adaptation can happen more gracefully. In other words, if we have a plan and we write it down in our planner and we tell someone else this is what we're doing, but then circumstances change, a lot of us will not change what's in our planner. Or we'll feel that something's gone wrong because we couldn't stick to our plan. But all that goes out the window when we can actually feel the texture, shape, heft of time and just be making plans, but holding them very loosely and being more spontaneous. I often have a list, and then I do a lot of things during the day, but none of them are on the list. Or I have a list and there's just a lot of things on the list that don't get done, and then I just delete them and nothing happens. Nothing ever goes wrong. It's like, okay, those things just weren't important. So you can have that kind of flexibility when you recognize that you're not the one planning this whole thing. You're actually a player in the plan, not the planner. Then there's just the ordinary way that most of us relate to linear time and our calendars and things we're supposed to do, etc. The differences in how we relate to that have to do, on one level, with our doshas. People with vata dosha predominant or vata imbalance are going to have a harder time keeping time. They're going to be more scattered. They're going to be more feeling like things are overwhelming when things are out of balance. And a kapha person, when they're out of balance, they're going to be the great procrastinators. They're just going to be like, nah, I don't feel like doing that. Or they're going to make plans and then cancel them because they just don't feel like it anymore. Something like that when they're out of balance. And then a pitta person's going to be like holding everyone to the exact moment. We said we would do this at 3 p.m. It's 3:01. I've calmed down over the years, but we still have our doshas. Those don't go away. So when we're out of balance, whatever our predominant doshas are, that's what expresses itself. We also have our astrology. We have what my Dzogchen teacher called our unique dimension, which is everyone is configured absolutely uniquely. We have different relationships to everything, including time. And a lot of that can be looked at in our astrology charts, which are basically a little narrative about us and how we're showing up in this lifetime. I remember when I first started studying with my Jyotish teacher, the very first thing she said to me when she looked at my chart was, wow, you could set your clock by you. That was her very first impression of my chart. She might have looked at somebody else's chart and said, wow, I'm not going to make any plans with you. You never keep your plans. It could be anything and everything in between. It's really part of our unique dimension. On the one hand, our doshas and our astrology and however else we chart. Dosha and astrology are just narratives about our unique dimensions. They help us to understand that. And then there's just the larger issue of how in touch are we with time? Do we feel the time? One of the little practices that came from my original Diksha lineage was to train yourself to know what time it is without looking at a clock. As timely as I can be, I tried that, and I'm never right. Not down with any precision that could claim any accomplishment in that area. I can look out the window in the morning at a certain time of year and guess that it's around 5 a.m. or something like that. But I can't tell you if it's 5:14 or 5:38. That's what's being suggested by this practice, that you could train yourself to do that, which is kind of interesting, but the kappa side of me was too lazy to bother.
I have a question about not wanting to make decisions.
Well, the decision is to follow your felt sense of wisdom. It might look like I'm making decisions, and I do sometimes because I don't always have a felt sense of wisdom about something. We all have our areas of blockage, but it might look a lot of the time like I'm making a decision, but really I'm constantly just feeling what is the right direction to go, a sense of rightness, a sense of goodness, a sense of this is the way. And then something comes out of my mouth that sounds like a decision. But I'm not really making it in an intellectual way. I'm going along with the felt sense of what direction things should go in. So that's like being in a state of constant divination. But it's basically just following that felt sense. And not everybody has a steady enough access to that felt sense to do that. So we have to rely on other things. And that's good. There's nothing wrong with that. Many people have a very strong attachment to making decisions in an intellectual or a mental way. They're afraid to just follow the impulse of wisdom that they feel. So that's something that we have to train ourselves to have confidence in. And certainly I had to train myself to have confidence in that too. I always felt that upsurge of wisdom since I was the youngest I can remember, but I didn't know what it was. I just knew that when I didn't follow it, I felt terrible. I felt a sense of sickness, almost like flu-like symptoms. But when I got older, I had a teacher, one of my very first teachers, who taught us specifically how to identify that and follow it. I gained so much confidence from doing that, from putting that into place as a practice. What you notice as you go along is that in the areas where you're more karmically compacted, it's harder to follow wisdom because that karma has a narrative. It's going me, 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 me in your ear when the wisdom's coming from here, from the heart space. But if you have a lot of karma wound around something, there's other things going on. And so often people get distracted by that and they feel afraid to follow wisdom and just do the thing that they're being told to do. I came from a family where there was a lot of drug addiction, not my own, but other people in my family. It was at a time when there wasn't as much knowledge about drug addiction in the general populace. I didn't know anything about AA or NA or Al-Anon. There wasn't like a discourse around that, or family systems or anything like that. So when I was about 21 or 22, I hooked up with a drug addict alcoholic as a love partner. I didn't have any idea this had anything to do with my family history. I just thought, oh, accidental. Then I started going to Al-Anon, and it was an absolute revelation to me at that time. And I remember it was about the same time that I was learning more things to follow wisdom. And I remember learning some things from Al-Anon about enabling. And the first time my partner asked me for money to get on the subway because they'd spent all their money on drugs. And I felt conflicted about whether or not to hand the money over. And I remember how hard it was to say no. Like wisdom was saying no, but in my head it was like, oh, but it's so little money and then they won't be able to get on the subway and you'll be a bad girl. All this chit chat going on in my head. But I didn't hand the money over. And I did get a sneer, as a response. But I felt so empowered after that to listen to what my wisdom was telling me. My experience was the more I did that, even in those very karmically impacted situations where you don't have as much clarity as you normally would, the more confident I became in life, in that voice, in that feeling, until a few years later, when I was in graduate school, I remember the day and I remember exactly where I was I was walking across this courtyard at school and I stopped and I was like, I am following this voice all day long. This is what I'm doing. It was such a surprise that I was leading my life this way. Kind of dawned on me. That's what you can do instead of making decisions. You're still deciding to follow that. And there's less and less room, there's less and less space between that wisdom and you as time goes by. Most of the time, I don't have to go in the heart space and feel what's happening. It's just happening. There's no space between me and that so much anymore. Sometimes there is, but not so much as there used to be. So it feels more, I'm just doing the thing, gliding along, not thinking about much of anything.
I see sometimes in activist circles, like online and at events, where people are really adamantly against police and will dehumanize police and other people. That doesn't feel like a place that I want to go to.
Well, on a bigger macro level, we're not going to change anything if we dehumanize anybody. If we always separate into us and them and dehumanize people and reject and all this stuff, and we can't feel any compassion for people who are assholes or have radically different views than we do or act in a way that we think is heinous, if we can't also feel compassion for them and see them as full beings the way that we are, nothing will ever change. We can have any system of government we want, but it'll just end up being the same because we don't care about each other enough. That's the problem. The problem is we don't care about each other enough. And we don't care about everyone. That is the problem, not what system of government we have. Until we start actually caring about each other full on, then we're just going to keep ending up back in the same spot. That's something you can hold in your heart, and you can hold that in your tone of voice. You don't have to participate in denigrating and dehumanizing people in any overt way. You don't have to shout slogans at police or whatever. It feels wrong to you. So one way of handling that is to just not participate. And I have tried a little bit to bring this up in circumstances where people were dehumanizing their enemies. Our enemies are us. That is the most important lesson, really. I was saying this all through the Trump, when he was running for president and when he was president. Trump is like us. We have to look in that mirror. We can't just reject that. Otherwise, we lose the wisdom in the circumstance. The same with Israel and Palestine. I have tried to both absolutely condemn a genocide at the same time that I've tried to bring some opening to be sympathetic toward the suffering that Israeli people are going through. And that's hard. And I only do it where I think there's an opening, because there's not always an opening. And then you just have to not do anything about it. You can't always do something about it. When I tried to do that with the electronic intifada, when they were sneering at the killing of Israeli soldiers, somebody was writing on the chat, "Oh, hello from Tel Aviv," as if I were in Tel Aviv as some sort of troll. And I wrote a letter to the electronic intifada saying, "You guys are so sweet and so compassionate. What's up with the sneering business? This is not okay. This isn't what's going to change anything." They never wrote me back. That happens too. But you just have to be very judicious. We're so used to the Abrahamic traditions. This is not true in Hinduism. But in the Abrahamic traditions, you have enemies, and there's good and evil. And everything's very polarized. And this is how people have been trained to think. It's not an easy thing to bring to people's attention, but we are just not going to have a different society or a different world if we don't learn to feel compassion for everyone, regardless of their condition. We just aren't. It doesn't matter whether it's democracy or communism or socialism or fascism, it's all going to end up in the same place.
Usually what I've done in similar circumstances is talk about the institution and take it away from a person to what could change as an institution.
Well, that's the solution that we have been trained to gravitate toward. Change the structure. change the institution. Let's have justice. Let's have laws, that kind of change. But that is horizontal change. That isn't vertical change. Because you can still treat people horribly, even if you change the structure. What is going to actually make us treat people better? We have to learn how to express anger and how to be extremely forceful in our response to violence and terror and things like that, at the same time that we are not dehumanizing people. And that is an incredible skill. That is not easy. You're just doing what you've been trained to do. We think that if we change something from the top, it's going to change the base. And that's not true. We have to be able to look at every situation happening as a mirror. Every situation that's happening has got wisdom in it, and everything is a mirror. And we have to look fearlessly into those mirrors. In the example of the soldiers, what I wrote to the electronic intifada was, they were talking about them like, oh, they're cowards. Look, they ran away when they were being shot at, blah, blah, blah. First of all, most of them are not even out of their teens, and they're not very well-trained soldiers, and they're scared to death. Maybe running is the most human thing they could possibly do. This is just not okay that we gloat over their cowardice, is what was happening on the news show. They were gloating. And this is not okay. This is not how change will happen. So if you looked at that situation and you're like, we have to change the way soldiers are trained, and, you know, it doesn't really work that way. We have to change here. That sounds namby-pamby, but it's actually an incredibly tall order. Police are just people being abusive with guns. They have been brainwashed. There's a whole lot of brainwashing going on. But we've been brainwashed too, in all kinds of ways. We have all kinds of zones in our lives where we aren't really in touch with reality or facts. So when we look at very brainwashed people, we should be like, okay, what is that saying about me? How can I be less brainwashed? I'm almost embarrassed to admit it, but before the 2020 presidential election started, or the whole process of the election, some part of me thought we still had a democracy. That's brainwashing. That's lack of clarity, lack of facts, lack of looking hard enough to see what's really going on. And I had a moment when that whole process was happening where I realized, okay, this really isn't a democracy. And I felt grief over losing my brainwashing. We all have that, no matter how clear-headed we think we are. We see our attachments and we see lots of things when these events are happening, and we have to use them that way. I was really surprised. I mean, I really was like, wow, I'm really attached to the idea that this is democracy. I had not realized that. But the evidence was there all along. I was just late to looking.
Any recommendations there as far as like a compassion practice?
Well, first of all, I'd say you don't know what compassion is. It's not a thought process. It's not something you arrive at by thinking. It doesn't exclude being angry either. There's many different kinds of anger, and there's forms of anger that are quite enlightened, that really help to cut through situations and bring clarity. Everything that you're saying is the product of cultures that value ordinary mind thinking above everything else and mental machinations. But the fact is that compassion is not something that is in you. It's actually in everything. It's part of what reality is made of. It's one of the fundamental wisdoms that's being expressed here. And when we do spiritual practice, we just feel it. We don't have to think about it or decide about it or weigh pros and cons of it. It just happens, and it's a feeling. It's a kind of super emotion that brings skillful action and really helps to resolve a lot of things between you and other people when you actually feel it. But it's not a mental thing that we arrive at or try to embody or cultivate or anything like that. It's just what happens when we are more open to what is really going on here. And we can also be angry and crabby We can have karmas and still feel compassion. None of these are mutually exclusive. For instance, when we are more in touch with natural compassion, we might be angry at someone or we might be arguing with them. We might even raise our voice. Maybe we'll even feel like we're losing it. But we won't try to hurt the other person. We won't want to injure anybody else just because we're angry. We'll still want to protect them in some way. The other misconception about compassion is that it means we have to want to spend time with people. You brought up someone's a victim of oppression or violence. Who hasn't been? We don't have to be around every person just because we feel compassion for them. We can be discerning about how we spend our time and our energy, and we can protect our lives and our practice at the same time that we feel compassion for people. And all of this is possible when we understand that compassion is what I call a wisdom virtue. It's not just an emotion in an ordinary sense, but it's imbued with wisdom and it brings skillful action. And it is something that opens out in us inevitably when we do practice. We don't have to do anything but do practice, and compassion begins to be more available to us. So don't worry about it so much. Just be yourself. Do practice every day, and you'll just see what happens. The nature of yourself, your essence nature, is full of compassion, unfettered, unbound, with no conditions whatsoever. But you were fashioned with some limitations. You're having an experience of those now, and you've been conditioned. The way that you're expressing your questions about compassion is conditioned. Compassion is just an absolute wild card, and it doesn't matter what anyone has done or what they've not done or who they are or what you think of them. It flows absolutely freely. When we are doing practice, that's what we are signing on for, is to be swept away by that free flow of all those wisdom virtues, not just compassion, but all of them. So try to drop any idea that you're going to decide how to be compassionate or choose between compassion and anger. Just drop all of that. All of that is useless. And when you're confronted with somebody and you're feeling like you're swept away by anger or whatever kind of emotion you're feeling, just take a pause and try to feel them and recognize that they are suffering also. And that's all. Just let the rest take care of itself. You don't have to do anything, and you can protect yourself. You don't have to be around anyone that's victimized you. That's not required to feel compassion. Satsang with Shambhavi is produced by Jaya Kula, a nonprofit community offering opportunities to learn and practice in the direct realization traditions of Trika Shaivism and Dzogchen. If you enjoyed listening, please help us keep this podcast and many other teachings open to all by making a monthly or one-time donation. Visit jayakula.org to make a donation and explore more of our offerings.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.